So a little bit of background on myself. It's really great to be speaking at the IoT Security Foundation conference today because it's traditionally not an environment that the organisation that I represent, or even in reality that the market that we sit in represents, are involved with. And I know there are some familiar faces in here to heckle me if needed. So a little bit of background on myself for the canned introduction from Jeff. So yeah, I work for Axis Communications, who are a physical security provider, turnkey. They do a lot of camera surveillance technologies, and I'll talk about why that's relevant. But I do also sit in a couple of different industry boards and look at regulations and standards, sit within the Industry and Parliamentary Trust, attend a lot of their events looking at why physical security is important, yet how do we regulate and create standards around that within the IoT space. Is there a presentation? Or do I click on a presentation? I can talk without a presentation. Yeah.
Just open it from
there we go. Excellent. So the organisers have asked me to look at the technologies that we deploy and essentially what's important. So if this was a physical security audience, the background of the majority of these people wouldn't be technology companies or technology experts. They'd be from a law enforcement or a military background. So their thought processes are around threat and risk, absolutely, and that's important to them. But now we're starting to see the convergence of technologies, and that technology considerations are becoming really important. Now, if we look at why it sits within IoT, well, the Myra botnet, that was an attack against CCTV systems. And there's a lot of resistance within physical security markets to say whether or not CCTV systems should even be called CCTV systems anymore, because that's a closed circuit. It's not IoT. Yeah, it absolutely is. The market itself has moved into IoT, hence Myra botnet. So it's the terminology of this market has actually changed. If we look at around the convergence of the technology, so the first CCTV camera was introduced in 1949. The first IP camera was created in 1996. And it was only until 2 years ago that the market started to truly embrace IP security technologies. And that flip has occurred. So now 80% of all video surveillance, not CCTV, is now IP. It's now IT. It's an IoT device. And that market capacity is approximately 35 billion at the moment. So that's why it is incredibly important when we start to look at physical security. Yet the expectations for that market size are 62 billion within the next 4 years. So these are physical security devices that are IT enabled. Yet the maturity and the education that sits within that market space, to say there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done is probably an understatement. So I'll talk around some of the stakeholders in cyber, and obviously, unsurprisingly, the manufacturer sits at the pointy end. And should it just be the manufacturer's responsibility to make sure that the IoT devices are secure? Well, that's the bare minimum, that's the starting point. We have systems integrators, so these are the individuals, the companies that are actually employed to deploy these technologies. And this is probably the area that we need to invest the most amount of education into. And then end users as well, and I'll talk about why there's resistance in that space. In reality, it goes far beyond those three different stakeholders when looking at security technologies for physical security. Consultants. Now, a consultant has been employed by an organisation because that's where their skill set lies. Now, I have seen on numerous occasions where a consultant will say, that's not my responsibility, that I'll just address the threat and risk. The technology aspect, well, I'll leave that with a different department. I'll make our recommendations what it needs to do. So that's one area that needs to be considered. Distribution. Now, distribution in the UK, there's a huge amount of challenges that we face there, because if someone's actually they're going to play or tamper around with a piece of technology, it's going to be in the distribution chain. So what is the technology doing? How's the technology behaving within the channel? Government, for the first time, we've started to see government actually embrace physical security, and there's a number of working groups within the UK. Tony Porter, who's the UK Surveillance Commissioner, is now, for the first time, started to address cyber and the IoT security at a government level. And so there's a lot of work being done there. And then I touch base, we obviously have the General Data Protection Regulation, I won't talk about that. The NIS Directive as well, there's a lot of good work. But for the first time, we're starting to legislate around technology. Although it feels a little like we have to self-police it and we have to self-govern it and create specifications ourselves at the moment, but there's a lot of room for improvement. We've got the bad guys, the criminals. Now, what they're incredibly good at doing is sharing information. But as security practitioners in the physical security world, we don't like speaking to anybody. We don't like talking about data breaches. We don't like talking about a threat to our business or enterprise. We don't speak, the bad guys do. And then we talk around the consumer as well. So that's the end user, but it's actually the people that are using these devices. Actually, are these people that are using these devices, do they understand the implications of setting them up, commissioning, and actually operating these tools? So we talk around the technology convergence. Traditionally, the UK has seen surveillance cameras deployed around coax. So a data cable to these guys, it's a bit of a dark art. And the reality is the market is so big, yet the channel is flooded with traditional CCTV installers they understand a coax cable. So I've got some comments. We run an academy, and it is there to try and educate people around different technologies, the deployment of technologies. And these are some of the comments that we've had this year. So that's an IT issue. So speaking to a lot of security practitioners, they don't take ownership of the fact that the technologies that they're deploying need to be secure. They see it as the roles and responsibilities of the IT team. Personal favourite of mine, where do I buy an IP address from? We were asked that question by somebody that is employed to install technologies onto a client's network. So I have loads on me, £10 a pop. But these people are actually being employed to install these technologies. What's a firewall? Yeah, these people are being paid money to install these systems, and then I've been doing this for 30 years, and that is absolutely right. A lot of these practitioners that have been employed have been installing these systems for 30, 40 years. And when we look at the challenges that they faced on a daily basis 20 years ago, it was trying to take down an old pan and tilt motor, mechanically fix it, and these guys are electricians at heart, and they might take some form of mechanical experience into their daily jobs. Now, does that 30 years experience mean they have the relevant skill sets to work on a corporate network? Absolutely. If they're asking what's a firewall or where do I buy an IP address from, I would suggest that they shouldn't be allowed on anyone's network. But when we look at the size of the channel in the UK, we are traditionally a market from the analog world that is stepping into the IT world. I would probably suggest that 80% of all companies out there installing security systems, physical security systems, have engineers with 30 years experience, but have they invested any of the time and effort in upskilling these engineers? You ask them what a Cisco CCNA or CIE qualification is, and they're probably blissfully unaware. But they have 30 years experience, so they must know what they're talking about. And that is one of the challenges that we face. It is about the experience. For the first time, I think this year, we all acknowledge it's been a year of sort of regulatory change. We talk around the GDPR guidelines and why it's important to physical security practitioners. I guess 4 weeks ago, I spoke around the NIS Directive. Has everyone heard of the NIS Directive? Excellent. So I spoke at a healthcare conference. So obviously, you know, as a service provider, essential service provider, hospitals have to comply with the NIS Directive. So they had, I'm going to guess, 200 people in this conference, all heads of security from all the big hospitals around the UK. 2 people put their hands up. They were, 2. Yes, Alan, 2. 2 people put their hands up when they were talking. Has anyone even heard of it? No, 2 people out of 200 people. So that's where, and when we focus on the NIS directive, it's around supply chain due diligence of the technologies that are being deployed across your estate. That's where it impacts for vendors and manufacturers. And these people are making decisions blissfully unaware of the ramifications of how badly it can go wrong. When we talk around surveillance systems, security systems, access control systems, these systems contain personally identifiable information. And whether we agree with it or we disagree with it, that's even the term that has come out from the ICO. So the Information Commission Officer talks around these devices, data protection by design, need to be secure because they contain personally identifiable information. We can't get around that. The government has come out and said that now. When we focus on the NIS directive, there's a statement in there that talks around supply chain due diligence, making sure that you understand the behaviours of the companies that you're working with, and lots of information around that. And that's what I'll focus on today, because that's where an IoT manufacturer company that sit within physical security can actually help protect a lot of these end users. And it's not all around the actual technology and the technology itself. It's around their own internal policies and processes. In physical security, it seems like a dark art, when in reality, there's a lot of good things that have come out of the IT industry. Yet physical security need to embrace this, because it is best practice and it is lessons learned from 20 years of mistakes from the IT industry. Why is it important? Well, they talk around 63% of data breaches. So this came from out the PwC, not me, so if anyone's seen it higher or lower, don't shoot the messenger. But it talks around third parties. But when we have an installer talking about what's an IP address, how much does it cost, where do I buy it from, it's no surprise that third parties impact a company's compliance or a company's security when it comes to cyber. And then we talk around sort of maintenance aspects as well. So we've done a study in the UK, and they reckon that nearly 70% of all security surveillance systems, when they are bid against, they don't actually request a maintenance contract. Yet they're now deploying these technologies that they're crying out for maintenance contract, because we find vulnerabilities in technologies that need fixing. But if there isn't a service or maintenance contract in place, whose responsibility is it to fix it? So, yeah, areas for consideration. And then obviously cyber being, it's only as strong as the weakest link. I'll give you some examples of where physical security systems have been hacked. So, in the US, around Donald Trump's inauguration, some Romanian hackers, they took down the Washington surveillance or CCTV system. So that was their own denial of service. And why? Because the police said, if there is no security and no surveillance on site, this can't happen. For safety, security, it can't happen. They got it up and running again. And the reality of it was, this wasn't a technology fault. This was actually a piece of poorly designed technology. In Australia, the real Ocean's 11. So I had my suspicions that this might have been a nice little story to speak about at a conference. I had a little look, and it's absolutely true. So hackers broke in and hacked into the CCTV system, and they were able to relay messages down to people on the casino floor to tell people who was playing what hand. And that enabled them a competitive advantage to walk out the front door with $32 million. So what is the impact of a surveillance or a security system being hacked? So this is loss of earnings based on these companies, or if you look at state-sponsored espionage, what happens if all the cameras in London were switched off? What would the impact of that be? So this is where the security system was actually used against the end user that has it deployed. So they lost. There's no one crying that a casino lost 32 million, I'm sure. One a little closer to home. So this came out in the Daily Mail. So they talk around, and I like the term at the top, hackers break into school CCTV system and stream footage of pupils live on the internet. That is a terrible word, hackers. This system was not hacked. So essentially what had happened was a contracting company had installed IP-enabled cameras. They'd screwed it onto the wall. they'd put a PoE cable into it, and they'd left. And that was it. So they changed no passwords, there was no form of encryption, and the big one is it had a phone home feature. So it instantly tried to phone and burrow out of the network. Oh no, it didn't. That's what it did. So how someone can claim that that system has been hacked, I don't know. Somebody has just identified the streams on the internet. Now, the problem with that is security industry gets a bad reputation for that. And in reality, this was absolutely preventable. So in reality, when you read about this instance, this was a badly designed piece of technology, badly deployed. Now, if either of those had been addressed correctly, this wouldn't have happened. Now, for the Daily Mail to get on this, it got uproar because obviously the UK's got the safeguarding initiatives. So when people found out that these schools had been hacked and you could go on a website and you could take live footage out, understandably, you know, people started jumping all over this. So the ICO's investigating this at the moment to see how this is. At best, what we can see here is pupils' faces. So this is classed as personally identifiable information. So this will fall foul of the General Data Protection Regulation or DPA 28. Yeah?
Is there a clear delimitation between poor design and technical flaw? Because a technical flaw can very clearly stem from poor design of the program, and to some extent this is an extension of all of that.
It is. Well, in what sort of sense? So poor design is that actually if the specification said it must do X, Y, and Z, this would have been prevented. So the design aspect of it didn't take that into consideration. Should the manufacturer fall foul of this? Absolutely, because this was a badly designed piece of technology. So if we look at data protection by design, Article 25, you look at what it stipulates. Then absolutely we need to consider some of these points.
So were the installers supposed to have done something else which they neglected to do?
So I don't know that because it's only been out, so this is why it's being investigated to see if we look at, you got your 72 hours, where does the role, whose fault was it? That's what's being addressed at the moment. I am getting moved on. So we have Target. Has anyone even read about what happened to Target? I think it was 4 years ago. So absolutely, this fell foul of their HVAC provider. This wasn't actually a security vulnerability in the device. This was a phishing email, and it was they hadn't partitioned their network, remote access, all that good stuff. This has currently cost Target about 296 million. They lost 40 million people's personal data. But the reality of it is they lost a case where now the banks are saying, well, this was preventable, it shouldn't have happened, we've had to pay out, and we're talking billions of dollars now, with the banks have had to pay out and the insurance providers. So that's where they've come out of Target. But this was completely preventable. So we look at what's important. I throw this up Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus. There are 3 companies in the UK that manufacture security technologies that have this. And is this even far enough? It absolutely isn't. There should be a lot more that sits behind this. But for 3 companies that sell security technologies or manufacture security technologies in the UK to have this is very poor. Now, this is an internal look on a business. So again, if I was talking to security professionals, they'd be blissfully unaware of what Cyber Essentials was. To this audience, it's probably more frequent. Building security and maturity models. So this is where a business can actually document how they vulnerability scan and even pen test their own equipment. So ask them. So companies should actually look at how they're writing code, how they're designing technologies, because ultimately, if it's not done correctly at factory or at design stage, then things like the attack on the school or not even the hack on the school happen. Completely preventable. There's something in the National Cybersecurity Strategy released in 2016 that talks around secure by default or out-of-box security. And it has some examples: password prompts, strength indicators, encryption, remote access disabled. So I sit within a committee that is looking at the UK's Camera Surveillance Commissioner's guidelines around security of devices. So we had 20 manufacturers in a room, and 3 said they could do that today. 3 companies. And when they looked at it, they said, well, the challenge that we have is we can't really guarantee the encryption because the encryption's more processing capabilities. You know, we're going to create latency across the network. The big challenge one was around remote access disabled out of box. Yeah, that's the biggest one. That's the biggest point of concern. And that's where 17 of those 20 manufacturers were. They couldn't even provide that. Vulnerability management. Again, we talk about vulnerability management. It's not a sales pitch. This is an honest and open, transparent means of identifying if someone's vulnerability scanning or pen testing their own kit, or they're working with researchers, they'll identify vulnerabilities. Absolutely. But how do they communicate that out to the channel? What is their commitment to get it fixed? So we work with a lot of companies, and there is one large bank, I won't tell you who it is, because they have an access control system that doesn't work anymore. And why? Because they've identified vulnerabilities in it that the manufacturer won't fix, and they won't fix it because they're not going to make any money out of it next year. They're going to end of life it. This is a sales opportunity. And at the same time, if a company is brave enough, well, we talk about Microsoft, what, 4,500 fixes? Is it like Patchy Tuesday? In the security market, people go, well, vulnerability. Oh, it's terrible news. And they hide from that. Whereas in the IT world, it's standard best practice. So it's actually getting security companies that are installing IoT devices to take responsibility and understand that this is important. Security advisory notifications. So if we look at how technology is deployed, the likelihood is it's not the manufacturer that actually deploys the technology. There's going to be some form of supply chain within that. So that might be an installation company, it might be distribution, however that is. So what happens in, say, 7 years' time when the technology is out of warranty? How does someone communicate with the end user that has a technology that has a vulnerability in it? How do they tell someone, you have this is what you need to do to fix it, if the supply chain is broken down at all? Because there is no guarantees that the company that has installed it is still the incumbent supplier, or there is still no guarantee that the company that has installed it is even around anymore. So that's where manufacturers have the opportunity to communicate directly with the people that have these technologies deployed across their estate. We talk around transparency of OEM equipment. So OEM, for those that don't know, so it's original equipment manufacturer. And there's a lot of things that sit around this space. Now, I used to work for an American company, and in the US, they have the American First policy within procurement guidelines. So if there's an American procurement, you get scored favorably for procuring a piece of American technology, which is great. The challenge was when they went through the due diligence of working with certain manufacturers, they went, we don't want to work with them because they failed X, Y, and Z, but we'll work with this company because they're American. The reality of it was exactly the same piece of technology with a different logo on it. And it was. One failed the tests, one was American, so didn't go through the tests. And that's, yeah. Okay, I have a couple more. Pack your own bags. You go to security on airport, pack your own bags. Yes, they allow it on. No, they want you to find out what's in it. Device management inventory. So if you look across London at the moment, there's tens of thousands of cameras across lots of buildings. How does anyone manage and maintain that? And it is through a device management inventory. That's where you do firmwares. That's where you actually understand what's on the network. That's where you manage it. Hardening guides. That means nothing to a security company. This is the IKEA assembly kit for a device. And this is written around, the Home Office endorse this. So they talk around CSI Top 20. It's endorsed. Firmware strategies. So actually when a device comes out the box, how does it start to interact? Does it know that it's been tampered with? Does it recognize the firmware that's in this device? Second to last slide. Long-term support. He said, is there any chance you can speak for longer than the 20 minutes? Long-term support, again, this is something that the security market hasn't seen before, because how do you support IT equipment? Because they've come from an analog background. And one of the reasons that people don't update firmware is because they don't want it to lose its integration with other technologies, and its long-term support, it just addresses the security vulnerabilities without it impacting any other areas. And the last slide, cybersecurity is important. It's something that physical security companies need to embrace, and it's something that IT companies need to enforce on security companies, because slowly but surely they'll get there, but they need people to support them throughout that process. Thank you very much.
Got time for one question.